Potawatomi,
arts,
culture,
and entertainment.
This is a Pace production.
Thank you, and thank you to Pace for inviting me to be here. It's a fantastic people, fantastic organization. So buy lots of beer, buy lots of art. We're really fortunate to have them in our community. So I'm here to talk tonight about Grant Wood. Now, has anyone seen the exhibit upstairs on the 4th floor? Yes, a few? Okay. So we have two artists primarily up there in that exhibit. One of them is Grant Wood, the other George Simons. And so I'm here to talk about, if you were at Dr. Warner's presentation, you heard a bit about Simons, and now we're going to talk a little bit about Grant Wood. So I struggled a little bit with what to call this one. I love Grant Wood. I'm an Iowa native, kind of a fan of art things in general. And so the title here is a reference to something that his wife said late in his life, that Grant Wood was a man who was always at war with himself. So specifically, what was the battle with inside himself was that he was wanting to be himself, his most genuine self, while at the same time being what society expected and wanted him to be. We'll see how that sort of conflicts in his art and in his life here as we go on. Okay, so I want to do this thing chronologically, but I also feel like any talk on Grant Wood probably has to start here. Raise your hand if you've seen this. I'm joking. You've all seen it. I did a Google search of American Gothic before I came here today. 6 million images and parody images. Mona Lisa had 3. Nobody even comes close. This is the most recognizable piece of American art ever. And we mostly recognize it as a sight gag, right? This is the original meme template, and we're still using it today. And this is something that happened almost instantly. So American Gothic, this premiered in the Art Institute of Chicago, 1930. This was Grant Wood's big breakthrough. Instantly went viral for its day, which meant it was republished in newspapers all across the country. And it was instantly a culture wars piece. It was instantly, memeified and remixed like it is today. There's just something about the piece that just begs to be reinterpreted. So when this first appeared in Chicago in 1930, there were basically 2 interpretations of this piece. One is that this is a work of folk art, that this is a man who is depicting with warm nostalgia sort of a lost or a piece of America that was going away. The other sort of interpretation was that this was somehow cruel or mocking, or that this was not entirely sincere. And we'll see this theme come up again and again and again in Wood's art, which is this guy for real? Is he being sincere? So I'm going to take these away real quick, and we'll just do a little exercise. Pretend it's 1930, you're in Chicago, you're looking at this piece and you've never seen it before. You haven't seen it 10 million times before. Now, and you also have to imagine that it's not on a little screen, it's not a reproduction, it's a very large piece of art. These people are life-size or bigger, and they are right here, right in front of you, staring you in the eye. You know it has something to do with America, but they're just begging you, interpret me. What do I mean, right? We don't know who these people are. We don't know what their relationship is. The man's older. Are they married? But we know it has something to do with America. What's Grant Wood trying to tell us? I don't know about you. I don't feel warm nostalgia if I'm looking at it. I don't feel also that he's entirely making fun of these people. I think, sort of a sense of dread almost, or foreboding. I feel kind of a little bit of menace with the pitchfork. And I do feel also of some pride in the characters. So I don't know. We'll see this kind of come up again and again with audiences not quite knowing what to make of Grant Wood's art. So we're going to start now at the beginning of his life. So Grant Wood was born in 1891 in Anamassa, Iowa? Anamosa, I can't see it. Anamassa? Okay. Never been there, don't worry. It's a small farm town. Grant Wood was a very bashful kid. He said he was the most bashful person who had ever been on the planet. So his father, on the other hand, was a very manly, masculine man. That's what everyone said about him, he was the archetypal manly man, right? And so this was at a time when, for the first time in our history, we were making a distinction between how little boy children and how little girl children were supposed to be in our society. We had Roosevelt saying that you are supposed to be doing rough play, that boys are supposed to be doing sports. There were certain things that boys were not supposed to be doing at this time, namely drawing and art, and reading, things of that nature, which unfortunately was all that Grant Wood wanted to do as a child. So he was terrified of his father. When his father was home, he was doing art in the cellar. When his father was, when he was not home, he was underneath the kitchen table doing art while his mother Hattie cooked in the kitchen. So this is sort of a depiction of his house, and it's obviously exaggerated. They didn't have a table that big. But that would be the table that he would sit under. The man there on the little piano bench, that is the only depiction we have of Grant Wood's father. What's a little bit interesting about this piece is you sort of mirror it. You pretend like you're on the other side of the table. It lines up pretty well with The Last Supper, whereas we have here the father sort of leaning to the right, Jesus would be leaning to the left, and then the figure standing outside is a representation of Grant Wood himself, where he's sort of this literal outsider, you know? And so he doesn't feel like maybe he's entirely a part of it. I don't know what the piece means. I just wanted you to know what his house looks like when he was a kid. It looks something like that. So Grant Wood's father died when he was 10 years old, and he moved to Cedar Rapids with these two women. We have there on the left Nan, and on the right is Hattie. So that is his younger sister. If you don't recognize her, she was the model for American Gothic, so she might look familiar. And they were very close. They called themselves We Three. They lived together for years and years and years in a one-room bungalow, tiny space, so they were close physically and emotionally. And Grant Wood loved living with his family. In fact, he lived with his mother until 1935, and this was his most productive time, was when the mother took care of the finances and the cooking, and he was there and he was painting, and he loved, you know, his mom was modeling for him, he was selling paintings to support them. His sister was always there modeling as well, and they had a really great relationship. The thing about it was that living with your mother for such a long period of time was a little bit unusual, and it led to a little bit of speculation as to why is this man, this eligible bachelor, just living with his mom all of the time? Why isn't he getting married? Well, Grant Wood was a homosexual. It was the worst kept secret in Cedar Rapids. Everybody knew it. His models knew it. His students knew it. Of course, at the time, you were not openly gay because he would not have a livelihood. He would not be able to support his mother and things of that nature. So, and also living with his mother, not only did he love it, it gave him a really plausible excuse as to why he's not married, which is namely that he was taking care of his mother. But when we think of Grant Wood, we think of his trademark overalls, we think of his sort of bold scenes of rural life. But as a young man in his 20s and 30s, Grant Wood spent a lot of time traveling to Paris. He was painting in European styles. He had a sort of a bohemian beard and a bohemian style of dress and things of that nature. He spent some time in the Handicraft Guild up in Minnesota, which was an organization run by women. And this was a part of the sort of the arts and crafts movement in America. So early on, he was doing things. He was making lots of sets. He was making lots of jewelry, building lots of things with his hands, not so much painting. But when he did do painting, he was doing it on his trips to Paris, and he was doing it in this very European style. So the work on the left here is obviously an impressionist piece. And then on the right, we kind of have a pointillist piece. And these were, at the time in America, Impressionism was, especially in the Midwest, considered sort of a feminine technique. When you could see the brush strokes was considered a feminine sort of thing in artwork. And so it wasn't doing him any favors in terms of deferring speculation about his sexuality, but it was a style that he loved to do. Now, it's kind of odd to think about it now. We think of big brush strokes and Jackson Pollock and a bold whatever as being kind of a manly technique, but at the time, that's the way it was sort of thought of. And this piece I wanted to just kind of show you because he made these when I mentioned he was doing the Handicraft Guild and metal work and things of that nature. And we'll see a picture of this when you go upstairs. This would have been in the corn room piece that we'll talk about in a minute. And this is a chandelier, a corn chandelier. Now, obviously it's beautiful, it's really well done, but also it's a chandelier with corn on it. So it's kind of, I mean, let's be honest, it's corny, it's kind of kitsch, like. And so again, stuff like this begs the question, like, is this guy for real? How sincere is he being here? Like a corn chandelier, he tells you in absolutely, honestly, this is earnestly a thing, and you're kind of like, okay, I believe you, but also it's kind of weird, you know? So we're going to come back to that again, like, is this guy for real, is kind of the question. So I want to talk about Council Bluffs. Now the Grand Hotel burnt down. It was stood from 1891 to 1925, and so they replaced it here with the Hotel Chieftain. Hopefully there's a video playing. There were 8 stories and 153 rooms. It had 2 restaurants. It had private dining rooms. It had a ballroom that could hold 500 guests. And interestingly, for the people here that are involved with PACE, this was the original performance space of the Chanticleer Theater back then. So Grant Wood was brought in to paint some murals. Here's kind of the lobby. And in 1927, he had an exhibit there with another artist who we'll talk about here in just a minute. Okay, so in 1927, Eugene Epley, he is an Omaha hotel guy. He has hotels across the country. Grant Wood's picking up all kinds of little commissions here and there, doing different pieces all over the place, mostly in the Midwest. And one of those commissions was to do a series of hotels. And so he went to first Cedar Rapids, then Sioux City, then Council Bluffs. And in each of these Eugene Epley hotels, he painted sort of murals that would be in their meeting room spaces. In Council Bluffs here at the Hotel Chieftain, he did 2. There was the Pioneer Room and the Corn Room. So I have a couple pieces up here, and I apologize that the quality's bad. I had to pull the images off of a random website, and I couldn't have access to the originals. But this was the Pioneer Room that was one of the meeting room spaces there. And what's interesting about these is if you attended Dr. Warner's presentation on George Simons, or if you're at all familiar with that particular artist, these are exact reproductions of George Simon works. So George Simon, who was he? He was a folk artist. He was a man who traveled with Grant Wood. He was a man who was truly a folk artist. I mean, he was on a wagon. He was the cook, in the Wild West making beans, and on his spare time, he was sketching scenes of frontier life. And if you read his journal, he was barely literate. He had no formal education. This was a man who was just depicting things as he was seeing them at that historical moment in time. And so Grant Wood, on the other hand, college educated, studied art in Europe, coming from a different sort of background. Now, biographers of Grant Wood, and I've read a few of his biographies, they will skip over this period of his life almost entirely. They go straight to his mature work. Because we're in Council Bluffs, I want to spend a little time here because I think that this is an important period. And I think it was a real kind of aha moment for him when he was working on these murals. Because first of all, I think he fell in love with painting the Iowa landscape when he was studying George Simons, his work and his writings. And also, I think he was kind of finding a way in George Simons to be an artist that was masculine, that was blameless, that was free of speculation. Nobody would suspect George Simons of anything. So here, after this, he starts wearing overalls. He starts sort of speaking more plainly. He intentionally starts to misspell words sort of in the same way that George Simons did. And what he's doing here is sort of, it's a little bit performative in a way because obviously, like we talked about before, he was this bohemian who was highly educated, but also it was sort of a way of sort of protecting himself from speculation. So one thing I just want you to note about these pictures is that this is not Impressionist art. Up to this point, he was doing that European style, the big brush strokes. Here we have something, we see these rolling hills, everything's really rigid, it's really defined. And this was a departure point in his style because immediately after this, his work stops being Impressionist and starts being really rigid and defined, like we'll see here in a couple of slides. So I really think that he was on the cusp of his mature style when he was in Council Bluffs, and we'll see where that leads us in just a second. When you go upstairs, you'll see lots of pieces of the corn mural. This was a big room with sort of a depictions of corn in Iowa. You'll notice 2 signatures on it. There's Edgar Britton and there's George Simons. And it's not George Simons and Edgar Britton. They were co-creators of this piece. Now, throughout his career, George Simons would always have young male assistants and apprentices. Some of them were romances, others were not. Regardless, he loved mentoring and supporting upcoming artists. It was a really something that he loved to do. The Daily Nonpareil at the time, when observing them making this piece, said that the couple could The couple do not work in the capacity of artist and student, but rather as companions. So it really was a piece that they were, throughout all of these murals, working on together. And so when the hotel was completed and the murals were done, they invited 400 people to come. So lots of prominent people from Omaha and Council Bluffs came for a big party. And we will discuss a few of those characters a little later on. I guess right now, maybe just notice that this piece is sort of an impressionist style, right? We have the big brushstrokes. So what's interesting is that this was his last impressionist piece, was made here in Council Bluffs, and Grant Wood's first piece that more sort of approximates his later style was also made here in Council Bluffs. So I think that's kind of interesting. It's something that I don't really come across in the biographies, but I think it's an interesting point for the people here in Iowa. Now, immediately after he was done in Council Bluffs, Grant Wood was commissioned to do a $9,000 stained glass piece for War Memorial in Cedar Rapids. He had done a lot of work with metals and things like that, but no glass. So he went to Munich to supervise the production of this piece. And while he was there in Germany, he was kind of studying the Flemish masters, and that's where he kind of found a way, Grant Wood found a way to sort of reinvent his career. So with the Council Bluffs folk art sort of fresh in his mind, Wood goes to Germany and he encounters this sort of late Gothic style of the masters of Flanders of Germany. Now this is really rich, it's really detailed. The goal of this movement was to make their art as realistic as possible. They filled it with all kinds of symbolism, and it was very rigid, very kind of formal sometimes, sort of like this piece here. And Grant Wood would later claim that he sort of had an epiphany while looking at this piece. So while at the time, also in Germany, there was a movement called New Objectivity, which meant that these were German artists who wanted to return to objective reality. They wanted to return away from sort of the romance and expressionism back to objectivity. And so what's interesting about this piece to me is sort of, it commands attention. We have these people. Who are they? What's the relationship? It poses way more questions than it answers. And if you don't see the resemblance, then I'll do my crude Photoshop here so that you can kind of see maybe where the influence comes from. But when Grant Wood gets back to the U.S. from Germany, this is when his sort of mature work starts. And his first piece we saw earlier, was Woman with Plants, a picture of his mother, Hattie. Now this, I don't have time to get into it, but it's really meticulously composed. There's lots of allusions to mythology and Persephone and all of these different things. But with it, he denied that there was any of that. He gave it a really folksy sort of story that went with it, which was, he was away in Germany and he came back and he just saw his mother and he just painted her right on the spot because he missed home so much. I mean, if you look at it, it took hundreds of hours to paint. I mean, the story is completely made up. But that sort of story, that new folksy sort of attitude he was trying on went over really well with Midwest sort of audiences. He started getting lots of commissions and things like that. So in 1930, we mentioned American Gothic was there in Chicago, and this piece was there as well. This is called Stone City. Now, Stone City did not get a lot of attention. People who did commented, is that not Stone City? I think I got the right caption. Okay. Sorry, I can't see the screen. Did not get a lot of attention. The critics who sort of commented on it were sort of baffled. They kind of said, okay, this piece is bizarre, right? It overemphasizes design. It's a real departure from reality. It looks like it was made by an insane person. The trees are like perfect spheres. It looks like candy. It's really bizarre. So they didn't quite know what to make of it. And this painting is hanging at the Joslin in Omaha, if you ever get a chance to see it. And what's remarkable about it when you see it in person is just how artificial it looks. It looks like glass almost. There are no brush strokes on it. It was something he was so concerned about that he would go over his paintings with a razor blade to make sure that they were just no hint of the craftsmanship or the artist. It was just a really sort of meticulous process the way he was painting these. But this was the first of many landscapes. But I want you to look at that for a second and think back to George Simon's, because now what we have here from just 2 years prior to this is we have, again, the rolling hills. And then we look at these houses, and they're just tiny little crude boxes. And the trees, like George Simon's trees, are just sort of little spheres. So I think, in my mind, this was sort of an extension of what George Simon's was doing. He was taking that sort of that simplistic sort of thing that he was faithfully recreating, and then taking it just to this extreme level where your literal tiny squares, literal circles. And so this piece, I think, was less polarizing than American Gothic, but really it had the same response, which was, is this guy for real? Like, what is this? What am I looking at here? It was kind of baffling. What was sort of ironic, as we'll see later, when Grant Wood becomes involved and sort of associated with conservative political movements, was that it was the more liberal critics who loved his work at the time. His friend Gertrude Stein, she loved his work and said that because she thought that it was sort of critiquing America in ways. But we'll see later how some people feel the exact opposite. Now, some of his critics thought that Grant Wood's art was overtly sexual. Now, as Freud would say, sometimes cigar is a cigar, sometimes a silo is a silo, and hills are hills. But I'll leave it up to you if you think those hills look like a butt or not. But but you do see this type of thing again and again, and it did not go unnoticed by critics. And in fact, a lot of critics really objected to his work, saying that they thought that, okay, we know what you're doing here. And again, this is the same thing. Are you being sincere? Are you drawing a picture of a butt? Like, really? Like, what do we make of this guy? Is this guy for real? So he was really walking a fine line, again, like we talked about at the beginning, between him wanting to really be his true self and express himself, and also what people were sort of expecting from his art. So Grant Wood was a fan of communal living. He spent a lot of time visiting the Amana colonies in Iowa. He spent time up at the Craft Guild. And at this time, after American Gothic, he was a real rock star of the American art world. He could kind of do what he wants. He was selling painting left and right, making all kinds of money. So he goes to Stone City and makes a sort of artist community. And you see these little carts that they lived in. These would have been the artist studios. Everyone had their own cart. They all decorated it. And so one newspaper at the time said that the scene was very festive and as gay as a gypsy caravan. So there was a lot of people coming. There was and it generated a lot of attention, but it was a financial failure. Grant Wood, as we'll see again later, was not at all good with money. He has lots of great ideas, but managing money is not one of his strong suits. So as Stone City was starting to fall apart, he was picked up by a New Deal program called the PWA. This was a New Deal program where they were hiring artists to go out and make murals to keep them employed during the Great Depression. So Grant Wood had a whole crew of young men. He called them his boys, and they painted murals in all different places. If you've been to Iowa State, they have big murals at their library. That was the PWA project that brought those there. One of Grant Wood's boys, so-called, was a man by the name of John Drake Pusey. I wrote a quick article about him in the Iowa History Journal. He is from Council Bluffs. And the PWA crowd tried to have Grant Wood removed. They didn't like him. They thought he was sort of overbearing or something. But Pusey, the boy from Council Bluffs, loved Grant Wood. He idolized him. He modeled his whole career after him. He painted camouflage during World War II as Wood had done and won. He traveled to Europe and did shows as Wood had done. So every single thing he tried to sort of build his career to be the next Grant Wood. And he was here from Council Bluffs and first met Grant Wood at the opening of the hotel in 1927. So now what happened is that Grant Wood became very famous. And he was getting requests to do commissions and murals from all over the place, more than he could possibly do, because again, he had this really meticulous style of painting. It took him a long time. So he was handing off all of those commissions and all of those requests to John Pusey here in Council Bluffs. And so a lot of murals, this is one that was done here in Council Bluffs at the funeral home that no longer exists to my knowledge. He did one at the house of Eli Lilly and various other places. These were all things that people wanted Grant Wood to do. Grant Wood said, I'm too busy, but I know a guy, and referred him to this guy here in Council Bluffs. I only mention it because it's Council Bluffs related. So here is one that is called The Birthplace of Herbert Hoover, and again, sort of touching on the theme that we mentioned earlier. Grant Wood was commissioned by some, I think it was the Daughters of the American Revolution, somebody to make a patriotic piece that was about the birthplace of Herbert Hoover, and it was supposed to be inspiring and patriotic, and he gave them this. And Herbert Hoover's house is somewhere in there. It's like one of the ones way in the back that's like this tiny thing. And, and he loved this piece, and he loved this style of painting. But the people who commissioned it said, what is this? Are you serious right now? Like, where is even the house? Like, I thought I was getting a patriotic piece, right? So again, kind of like, is this guy serious was the question. So we're getting now to talk about regionalism, the movement, so-called. So in 1933, there was someone named Maynard Walker. This was an art dealer from New York City, and he put on a show in Kansas City. He brought together 3 artists who did not really know each other, Grant Wood, John Stuart Coury, and Thomas Hart Benton. And he said that these artists represent this new movement, and this new movement's called regionalism. It was kind of a sales ploy, if I'm being honest, because in the Great Depression, there was really a desire for something to make us feel better. We were longing for the good old days, right? This was kind of like Make America Great Again sort of territory where we wanted to look back to the real America. And regionalism as a movement, as it was sort of stated and presented, said that, you know, these are real American artists. This is what America art is. And it definitely had a nationalist and sort of patriotic vibe to it. These artists didn't know each other too well. Their works didn't have a lot in common, but it really worked as sort of a sales pitch, and all of these men sort of saw their careers explode at this time. And Wood really embraced it because he saw it was getting a lot of traction. And so, you know, he made a piece called Return from Bohemia, where he's, you know, rejecting his roots of Europe. And then he ghost wrote a piece called Revolt Against the City, again, sort of talking about these regionalist themes. But Thomas Hart Benton took it sort of to the next level. He really wrote a lot of rather nasty things. He said that, you know, that the art world was just infested with Jews and homosexuals and all of these intellectuals who they wouldn't buy anything American or any real American art because it didn't have a French name, and they wouldn't know good art if they saw it. And it was a very sort of nationalist and kind of nasty vibe. And he even took a few jabs at Grant Wood, and sort of some implications there as well. So we're going to kind of get to, there was lots of beautiful pieces I would love to show you and talk about. We don't have a lot of time. We're going to kind of get to sort of some of the darker times of Grant Wood's life. Unfortunately, his life doesn't have a super happy ending. Like I mentioned earlier, he loved living with his sister and his mother. Well, Nan got married, and Hattie, his mother, got very sick. So they're living together in this little house, and he gets offered a job to be a professor at University of Iowa, which he has to take to make money. So he moves to University of Iowa, and his mother is dying. And while his mother's dying, she is friends with this woman, Sarah Maxon, and his mother dies, and Grant Wood's very depressed about this whole thing. He's living in Iowa City and marries this woman, Sarah. And it was kind of an unusual marriage. They were married in 1935. And Sarah said in her sort of unpublished memoir or autobiography that the marriage they did love each other very much. It was a genuine love, but it was in no way sexual. They had an agreement when they first met that this is a partnership, we're fellow artists, we're great friends, we're going to get married. Now, some of the more cynical biographers will say this was sort of a marriage of convenience for both of them. She needed money, he needed a reason for living alone now that his mother had died, and that they found each other that way. But if you read their writings, they really did love each other in a way, just not the way we think of for marriage. But the University of Iowa was sort of a real big change and a departure for his life, and not a good one. In Iowa City, he moves from living in a one-room house and having everything sort of taken care of for him to moving into a gigantic house with a new wife, and not really knowing how to manage his finances or what to do with all of this space. All kinds of strange people start living there. And Sarah, far from being a the folksy kind of persona he put on, you know, she wore pants and they were brightly colored, and it was very shocking at the time. She was very outspoken. And so the faculty there at University of Iowa did not like Grant Wood at all. They just resented how easily I think he got his job. There were a number of political reasons they didn't like him, but ultimately they tried to get him kicked out. They told everyone on the faculty senate or the chancellor or whomever that Grant Wood was gay, that he should not be a teacher here. And this was really devastating to him. And also at this time he's having all kinds of money problems because Sarah likes to buy things, and it gets him into sort of antiquing, and he's building. This is the height of the Great Depression. He's selling paintings for tens of thousands of dollars. He's really well off, but they blaze through all of their money very fast. And since he's sort of depressed at this stage in his life, is not making any art. He's very, very little output at this time. And so he needs to start making money. So back then, how you made money quickly as an artist is you would put together a series of lithographs and then you would sell them through the mail. So Grant Wood put together a series of lithographs that he intended to sell. This was one called Sultry Night. The United States Postal Service declared this piece and others to be pornography. They said they would not distribute it, and in fact it was illegal, and anyone who attempted to distribute it in the mail would be arrested for distributing pornography. This devastated Grant Wood. He insisted that his intentions were genuine, that it was a wholesome scene or whatever. He had made a painting of this that he had spent a lot of time on, and he cut it in half so it was just a painting of a bathtub. Threw all of the prints away and things, and ultimately didn't make any money off that project. So in the 1940s is when things get even darker, because we see sort of the rise in the 40s of Nazism, right? And so now this regionalism, where we're talking, especially where Benton's talking about the problem of the Jews and the homosexuals, right? This all sounds very fascist. It sounds a little bit too nationalist, and also the pictures of the farmers doing this sort of heroic work on the farm are presented as sort of heroes, also looks a bit like communist propaganda sort of work that we're starting to see at the time. So this style, this movement is dead. It's no longer in style at all. And so at this time, Jackson Pollock is considered the ideal. He's individualist, right? The new nostalgia, it's not about nostalgia. Now, the new type of patriotism is about individualism and the individual. And so, ironically, he was a student of Benton's. But I do put this piece up here on the left. This is called Parson Weems' Fable. I just want to talk about it really quickly. You have George Washington here cutting down the cherry tree. And then this man is Parson Weems, the guy who wrote that sort of story, that sort of fable. Now, he insisted this was a patriotic piece. This was about a history of America. But it's strange again, right? This is weird. Like, we have George Washington is a little man, but he's also has like he looks like the dollar bill. And we have slaves in the background picking cherries. And he's really drawing attention to how artificial this story is. You have the guy who literally wrote the tale pulling back the curtain. So if he was really truly making just a straight up patriotic piece, why would he introduce all of these sort of weird random elements that draw attention to sort of the artifice of it? Again, so sort of like, is this guy for real? Now in 1959, back in Council Bluffs again, I mentioned the murals, no longer in style. They're very dated. They take them down. At the time, anybody who lived at the place, I think it had been converted to apartments at that point, they could take a chunk of the mural. People were just coming and cutting them off. The Pioneer Room pieces survived more or less intact. Today, one of them's at Luft Hall at Iowa Western. Another one is in Cedar Rapids. The corn room that we'll see was carved up in every way, shape, and form imaginable and just distributed to whoever knows where, and it cannot be put back together again. So Grant Wood died in 1942, and on his deathbed, he sort of said, you know, when I get over this, I'm going to start a whole new life. I'm going to take a new identity, a new name. I'm going to go find a place out in the woods, and I'm going to live with whoever I want. I'm going to paint with whatever I want. I don't care anymore. So this tension we talked about between society's expectation and who he really wanted to be, he finally decided, as he was dying, I'm going to be who I want to be. But it was too late. He died of cancer. He did not get to realize that sort of new life. His last words, tragically, were Nan, who was not present there. And again, they were very close. I put this piece up here. This was his very last piece that he made. And what's interesting about it to me is that when he had said he freed himself of this burden, decided who he wanted to be, he went back to painting scenes in an impressionist style of Iowa that looked very much like the corn room that he made in Council Bluffs. So to me, that tells me that the work that he really loved to do, that he really enjoyed, was some of the work that you'll see upstairs. And once he no longer had to worry about expectations, that's what he wanted to do. So I have one slide left, we'll wrap things up. I want to talk about Wood's legacy. So the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, nobody knew who Grant Wood was. He was forgotten about. You go back and you look at the the literature at the time. He wasn't in any of the books. Nobody was talking about Grant Wood. Then we get to sort of the Reagan Revolution and the modern conservative movement, and there's sort of a revival. Now, people are kind of anxious about social change. Once again, we're talking about real America, right? We want to get back to real America. This was the Reagan sort of messaging, and they went back and they looked for real American artists, and what they came up with was Grant Wood. Now, what's a little bit sort of ironic about this is that in 2000s, they are trying to propose the constitutional amendment to say that marriage is between a man and a woman, right? Remember this? And at the time, this was called the American Gothic Amendment. Now, presumably, because there was a man and a woman in that painting, I'm not sure. Maybe they were married, I don't know. But that name in Grant Wood became associated with the fight to, disallow gay marriage. And then in 2009, this piece was published in the Des Moines Register when Iowa became the first state in the Union to legalize gay marriage. And so again, we see this sort of memification where this can mean so many different things to different people politically. But ultimately, I think that Grant Wood would have been happy that people today can not have to have that sort of struggle that he had and can live like they want to without those social expectations. And it was his sister Nan who really kept his legacy alive, kept all of his art, and she's really the reason that we know about him today. And so I think that is all I have. I think one thing, when you go upstairs, just take a look at those George Simon pieces and then kind of pull up on your phone some of those landscapes of Grant Wood and see if I'm crazy about the similarities. But I do think that there really was kind of a connection there. So thank you, guys.